Hello, everybody. Thank you to Friends of Kenwood for inviting me to speak, and thanks to you all for joining the Zoom today. This talk is about the making of An Allegory of Painting for the Royal Academy of Arts 2018-19, as part of the 250th birthday celebrations for the RA, marking the opening of their refurbished building on Piccadilly and new extension in Burlington Gardens. The talk is not a history of Kauffman herself. I'm a bit nervous because I know there's a wealth of knowledge out there and many academics associated with the Friends of Kenwood who know a lot about the subject. I did a lot of research at the time as part of my practice, but it's a while ago now. So I have a large range of images to show you. The first half of the talk is concerned with the research I made, and the second half concerned with the making of the work. Since 2010, I've been making work based on the lives of historical women, both real and fictional. It's a kind of mapping of my own cultural heritage. Through reading, drawing, and painting, I was trying to understand a little more about history, who gets to write it, and who gets to let people into that history. I began with paintings collectively called the Writers Series. Writers who had a connection to Regent's Park, or an imagined connection through their work. It came essentially from Woolf's idea of a room of one's own, the room of one's own being the park. The Heath would offer the same rich history, I imagine. In fact, I know the Heath better because there was something about the clear delineation of the park, like a composition in painting. I'd had a show at Roche Court in Salisbury, that's the New Art Centre, in 2013. Won the John Moores Painting Prize 2012, and Daunt Books published Park Notes in 2014. It's an anthology of my pictures and others and writing I'd selected, from Catherine Mansfield to Elizabeth Bowen to Woolf. So by 2015, I was researching artists as well as writers. There seemed to be many more writers at the time in the kind of women's history, but I began looking at the artists from 2015. And I would look to the RA, where I had studied in 1988 to 1991. I looked to them as a sort of an index, really, of what had been going on over the last couple of 100 years. And I have to say the female RAs are thin on the ground, as we know. There were Eileen Agar, who I like very much, Laura Knights, who was the first female RA, 1936, made thus 168 years after Angelica Kauffman, Mary Moser, who were elected at the very beginning of the RA in 1768. And for 168 years, there were no women associated with the RA at all. So the RA's history is essentially a 20th century history and 21st century history. So I came across Kauffman, never having heard of her before, despite my fine art degree being partially in art history. I think she sort of dropped off the history curriculum. She was certainly never mentioned, if she was ever there to begin with. I think she just went out of fashion. At the RA, there were 4 roundels of hers, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, part of Elements of Art, and they're there in the ceiling. And I had walked underneath them every day on my way to the schools as a student and never looked up, which I have to say is entirely my own fault. I can't blame anybody else for that. So I became really interested in her and who was she, where did she come from? So I went to the RA and I looked up for the first time for several years, and they weren't there. They had been taken into storage to be restored. And there's nothing but these kind of white cardboard replacements. Now, many of you will know that Benjamin West's roundels design here is usually here, the Graces unveiling nature, and Kauffman's 4 elements are here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Invention, composition, design, and color, painted in 1778, 1780, when she was living in London. So as far as I was concerned, I wanted to know a little bit more about Angelica Kauffman. I got in touch with Eliza Bonham Carter from the RA schools, who had been a friend of mine, but also a supporter. And she put me in touch with Alexandra Burnett, who was the kind of manager of the collections at the time, and Maurice Davis, who's the director of the collection. And they were just really helpful and really interested. And I was invited to go and see the newly restored works in the RA stores. I just wanted to show you these paintings also from the Courtauld Gallery. These are facsimiles, black and white facsimiles that are sort of in the Courtauld at the moment, in what would have been the RA Council and Assembly Room. I'm sure many of you have seen them there. I'm sure the Courtauld would have something to say about that as well. So I got in touch with the stewards, with the RA's wonderful conservation team, and they let me into their deepest, darkest secrets, into the storage RA, where I'd have to shoot anyone to say I'd let them know where I was going, because it's top secret. And here are the beautiful roundels, and I got to see them close up, and they'd been beautifully restored too. So my project started by drawing, because that's the nature of my process, really. I always like to start by drawing. I don't really think of it as copying. I think of it as an investigation. This roundel here is Disegno. It's an allegory. A woman is drawing, but she embodies drawing. What I like about these roundels is that the women in the images are all working artists. So yes, they're also a nod to being a Greek goddess, but they are also, their sleeves rolled up, they're also women artists, I think. And I think Kauffman sees them as a self-portrait of a sort. This is the Belvedere Torso on the right. Wanted to point out some wonderful details for you, because I would love to share these, because usually you can't see the details, you can't see the paintings close up because they're on the ceiling. I want to show you the sfumato on the top of the arm here, the type of mark making that makes a painting look as though it's less in focus, a little like a photograph might, and then the focus on this elbow here. And the beautiful drawing of the face, you know, she knew exactly when to give a very light touch with the eye and the nose, and when to kind of colour and lay on the paint more thickly, which I just found fascinating. Here again is a detail from Disegno, a beautiful detail of the drawing. You can see the Belvedere Torso here on the notes. The elements of art were allegories based on Joshua Reynolds' drawings, which his discourses, which I'm sure you'll all know. There's a picture of me in the stores. I wanted to say a little bit about my process of drawing, because I had taken all my kind of pencils and graphite and charcoal along with me, but I also had my daughter's pencil case and her kind of school crayons. And I ended up using those because the colour in Kauffman's work just sort of somehow spoke to colour and not really to the black and white form. Sorry about that. So I think from my own point of view, I know how much artists talk about always trying to get to the truth about painting. It can be very boring for everyone else to listen to, but artists love to talk about that. I imagine late nights in Kauffman's studio, in Reynolds' studio, discussing the potential of painting, what art should be, and they're really laying down some ground rules, like a new manifesto for painting based on European experience. And of course, Kauffman had that European experience, having studied in Italy, and she was very welcomed into London for her knowledge, very, very strong knowledge of Italian painting history. So I suggest, it's only a suggestion, that Kauffman would have had a huge input into Reynolds' discourses. And I'm sure they drank a lot of wine into the bargain. Another detail, I love this detail on the right from colour, the chameleon, which I think I was talking with Helen yesterday, and we were suggesting that maybe it's somehow representative of Kauffman herself. Obviously, in here, symbolic of colour and the change of colour. And I want to draw your attention here to the holes in the side of this roundel, where they were probably screwed directly to the ceiling in the current Burlington House building. Obviously, they were moved there in the 19th century. And yeah, someone sort of boldly screwed them to the ceiling, but at least they were put there. They might have been left in the storage forever. I also love this image of the rainbow because it seems to me a very scientific understanding of the refraction of light at the time. I guess, you know, the people did understand how the science of light, but I really like how she tried to depict it. And, you know, the transparency and layering here is very beautiful, I think. Again, another detail close up from Invention. I wanted to show you this in particular because in a way, this talk is about the fallibility of making work and the difficulty of making a painting, and the mistakes you make and how you have to respond to them. And I just love the fact that this, you know, she's obviously adjusted this hairdo here, painted it out. And it's nice to be able to see that adjustment. I also want to draw your attention to the highlights in her eyes and on her lips and the beauty of the color in the nose and the face. She just was such a star at knowing, I mean, she was a star at knowing what needed to be painted in order to be seen from the ground if they were in the ceiling. You know, she was clearly a very, had a very strong experience there from looking at a lot of Italian work probably. But look at these are slightly ridged, thick areas of highlight. And then she knows when to let it go and when to let the kind of the work become, the mark making become less definite. Here again is the globe from Invention, which I like very much and which I used also in my larger painting called The Rainbow, which is essentially the composition from Kauffman's own colour image. So my drawings looked a bit Walt Disney, I thought, but I didn't mind. Sometimes you have no control over these things. I drew them faithfully from the paintings, and what comes up when you're doing something like that isn't always within your control, and you find yourself making work in a way that you couldn't have imagined. That's the great thing about art, I find. It's a very much a journey and exploration. So these are rather garish drawings, I admit, but I was responding to the color that she was laying down in the paintings and the color I could see in the underpainting too. That seems to be very important, and this idea of layering and a sort of lightness of layer, as opposed to, I suppose, heavy impasto. This drawing on the right is from Composition, which is the fourth painting. I also use watercolor as very much essential to my practice. This is a very large watercolor painting of Invention as part of the study for the work. I felt that watercolor had something about it, that there's a fugitive sense of you not really quite being able to control the outcome. And that seemed to fit with Kauffman's own. Obviously, she was very much more accomplished than me, but she had a sort of, there's a lightness and what I call a fugitive sense to her work, which I think also is very contemporary. This is a studio wall image at the time, just to give you an idea of, idea of process, I suppose. I made lots and lots of drawings. I'm looking for the reason why to make this large painting, you know, why is she of interest to a contemporary audience? Why is she of interest to me? You know, how to make sense of the neoclassical imagery, the allegorical narrative, things which are really out of fashion now and out of date. And what meaning could they have for me? I saw a sense of openness, I think, in her work, an immediacy, a feeling of being in the moment. And I think you see that these drawings are trying to reflect that. There's something about the speed at which she painted and the swiftness of her mark, all of which I think are quite contemporary characteristics of contemporary painting. And then they use collage again on the right-hand side, which helped me work out the scale, although it didn't, you'll see. I usually work in a less figurative way, but the interesting thing was, maybe some of these images on the left are less figurative, and I thought the eventual painting would look like that. But the more I went on with the project, the more I understood that I had the hand of history slightly on my shoulder. More specifically, I had the hand of Angelica Kauffman on my shoulder, as if she was saying, wait, this is my painting, not your painting, don't mess with it. So it became more and more figurative as we went along. This is a fun image on the left, and I want to point it out because it also, in my defense, I want to show this little small ink study it's from the V&A actually in their collection, which we went to look at. I went to look at it with my fantastic curator, Tanya Moore, who I haven't mentioned yet. She now works for the Sainsbury collection. She was an amazing young curator at the time who did a lot of writing about Kauffman at the time, and Tanya and Morris and Alexandra, the three of us sort of on this journey together, along with a lot of the other collection and art history people from the RA. So Kauffman's arm here is a real model, I would say, wouldn't you say, here on this ink drawing? And she'd probably be having kittens if she realized it was now in the V&A, because I think maybe this is one image that indicates what a struggle she had with the drawing, and that arm must have become particularly tricky for me too. Handmade book I made for the RA library, basically collating all my research together. Part of that research meant looking into the RA archive, and you'll all be familiar with this Zoffany painting. This is an engraving from the Zoffany painting on the left, or maybe some of you, I should say, will be familiar with the Zoffany painting. Zoffany was a contemporary of Angelica Kauffman's at the time. It's an engraving from the painting of the Life Room, where obviously Angelica here and Mary Moser here are not allowed to go, where they're not allowed to go. How on earth women were supposed to learn to paint and draw the human figure if they weren't allowed in the Life Room, I don't know, but I feel certain that Angelica was so good at drawing the figure. Well, she drew a lot from the classical casts, as we know, but also I'm sure she had models in her studio. I mean, maybe not entirely nude, but I'm sure she used her own friends and contemporaries as models. Rather nasty image here, which I like to highlight just to remind ourselves to be watchful of these watchful of our own history. There's the artist Richard Cosway here, who has his stick directed onto the torso of a female nude cast, feet forward to the public, and he's got his stick rather aggressively on her torso there. Beautiful letter on the right here, signed Angelica Kauffman in an anglicized form. And so I have always spelt her name in this way because she did when she was in London. We don't know actually how she spelt her name abroad, but I know that it probably would have had a K, and most people spell it with a K and a double N on the continent. This is a letter which some of you will be aware of, where she's imploring her fellow RA gents to withdraw a painting made by Nathaniel Hone, which is basically taking the mickey out of her and Joshua Reynolds. Not a nice painting, not even a good painting, but I just wanted to show you her beautiful handwriting. And it's hard to read, I'm not going to read it all, but basically she is such a brilliant writer, and she writes with such authority, and she writes so well about the reasons why this painting should be withdrawn. She had great dignity, I think, as an artist, whilst being able to fit in with these guys. Hello. So this is Henry Singleton, the Royal Academicians in General Assembly. I point you to here, to Angelica and to Mary, also to the roundels here on the ceiling. This is composition, and here is disegno. I had the good fortune to go, I took my family hostage on a driving trip and said, well, we have to go to Schwarzenberg in Austria. And they moaned a bit, but then were very sweet about it. They went to the birthplace of Kaufmann's father, Joseph Johann Kauffmann. And here is the Angelica Kauffman Museum. Some of you may know it from the Schubertiad, which is held there annually. I learned a lot from visiting there. I learned that she really became a great painter because of her father. Her mother died early, and she accompanied her father, who was an ecclesiastic painter, who painted these. This is the Stations of the Cross in the church in Schwarzenberg. And we think that Angelica painted these roundels at the top there. She must have been very young at the time. This is her altarpiece in the same church, and a monument to her here. So finally I get to the studio, having done all this preparation. I have an architect friend help me with the design of this very large ovoid. The folks at the RA had said, you can have this space. We'd like you to do something for our 250th celebration. Here is the ramp space, which is the kind of hallway leading to the dining room at the RA. It's quite a tricky space because of it's basically has a ramp for a floor, and various strange railings and brick wall. And it seemed quite awkward at the time, and also seemed strange to put Angelica in an awkward space, but perhaps actually it was absolutely the right space. And I had a lot of fun with it. So they were very trusting and they let me do what I wanted. So I suggested making this very large ovoid as a nod to her roundel. I stretched it out a bit to fit the space. And originally I was going to have it sort of resting on the floor like a sculpture, diagonally fitting the space. But as time went on, I realized it just needed to be a painting in its own right. So I start work on these large drawings on the left. I make some terrible drawings in the studio, but just trying to get scale, trying to get used to what it feels like to make work on such a large scale, because it's a very different thing. And I'd never made anything this big before, even though most of my paintings are bigger than me. They aren't this big. And so it requires a whole different approach to scale and mark making. You can imagine you have to scale up your brushes. And then the day in October 2017, when the panels arrived, had the panels made by these wonderful artists Surfaces. It's a fabricator in Kent. If any of you are practicing artists, I really recommend them. It's a wonderful family firm, and they made me a beautiful plywood panel, steel backed with a gesso surface. I had to make it obviously in several parts in order to maneuver it around in and out of the studio, but I had no idea really, no concept really of how big it was going to be or how heavy. I had to deploy or I had to ask my wonderful husband, Martin Mills, to help me in the first early days of the work, because I couldn't lift the paintings from the floor. Usually I work on the floor and then move the paintings between the floor and the wall, because you can't really see what you're doing on the floor. Martin helped me a lot in these early days, shifting between floor and wall. I couldn't fit all 4 panels on one wall, so I had 3 panels on the wall covering the door, as you'll see, which had to keep open. And in fact, we hung this, as you can see, with the door closed, and then realized that the door was closed and we couldn't get out. So we had to take this panel off the end and then open the door, and the door had to be opened permanently. So this marks the beginning of the process, which, as I say, I often use watercolor in a large scale. They're kind of acrylic-based watercolor paints that have great luminosity and great pigmentation. And what follows now is I'm going to move through these slides quite quickly and show you the development of the painting. Now, I don't usually even let anyone in my studio, let alone show how awful the paintings look as they move along, but I've decided to be brave today and to share with you the journey of this painting. So I start sketching her in. She gets a little bolder, but at this stage I realize that the figure's just too big and it's never going to work, and there's something really ugly about the sort of giantesque hand and face. So I decide that something has to be done, and I redraw it, and redraw it in a tape just to see. This is something that lots of artists use as a way of kind of sketching out without actually having to mark the surface. Yeah, this is probably the worst stage of the work, where it's almost between two states. I don't know, perhaps this is the worst one. And that arm, you can see, is giving me an awful lot of trouble. It's just in the wrong position, it's in the wrong way. And then I get very frustrated finally, and this is probably December by now, and Martin comes to help again, takes the work off the wall, and I cover it in navy blue paint. I felt as though the large spaces needed activating, and they needed some kind of gesture that met maybe with her gesture, that spoke to her gesture, which is obviously, as we've seen, a very layered, it's very active, her painting. There's nothing that's sort of still or flat about her work. Finally, probably late December or mid-December, I sort of knock it into shape. I start making oil paint marks on top, and I begin to work in oil over the top here. This area here is oil. This area is oil. And I also start re-gessoing parts of the painting, because I realized that the background, some of it is just terrible, so it needs reworking. But I also think I needed to introduce some geometry to meet the circular geometric nature of the whole, which I hadn't understood from making the small studies. It's very difficult to understand the sort of internal structure of a very large painting until you're actually doing it. And I liked working, putting these gesso patches back in, because it reminded me of the fresco patches you sometimes see in restored fresco paintings in Italy. I retain the large elements of the previous painting because I want a sort of, I want a sense of disparity. I'm looking for a sense of tension and disconnection, because on a large scale you need some of that, but also I do think it was speaking to Angelica's work, in a way, my own interpretation of her work. I start spraying with an aerosol spray as well here, which creates a lightness, which is sort of very, you know, speaks also to the neoclassical mark. And then it's kind of winter and Christmas, and my family are really fed up with me by then, I think. But I get back in the studio in January, and it's just knocking it into shape. You can see that it's more or less coming into shape now. Still so much to do, but the panic is over. And I've got a little paper chameleon going on here, and I'm using these geometric white gessoed areas to carve up the space and to create a sense of layering and a sense of time within the painting. Face is still problematic, the arm is still problematic, but I feel a bit better. I actually have a deadline for the end of January, which is been pressing on my mind, for the three kings to come along. These are Royal Academy people who you may recognize. There's Christopher Lebrun here, who is president. There's Maurice Davis, who was the director of the collections, who I think may be with us today, so I'm a bit nervous about that. And there's Tim here, Tim Marlowe, who's the artistic director of the RA at the time. And they're the guys that commissioned the work. And here is Alexandra Burnett. And anyway, they seem to be quite happy. Back in the studio, finishing off this process constantly of reworking, redrawing, retaping. The sort of finishing off takes the time, strangely. They're bringing it all together. It's like fitting a jigsaw together. And then here we are, making some progress. I found it's an interesting struggle between the linearity of Kauffman's work, trying to speak to that, and speaking to the color and the freer mark making, the layering. So, which I thought maybe it was nicely reflected in both the design, drawing, maybe a linear form, allegory, and then the other allegory I'd chosen, color, which is more given to layering or shape, mark making. And I have to move it onto the back wall to make this is the first time I've seen it joined up here, and I like the sense of disconnect here. I was trying to make a kind of I think it helped define the overall shape of the overall sort of sense of space in the work. So some areas were meeting up and some weren't. So that more or less, the rainbow painting part of An Allegory of Painting was finished, and I set to work on the other painting for the ceiling of the Burlington House. Disegno was to be moved to the Royal Academy collection, this room here, beautifully redesigned, and they wanted something to replace it in the ceiling. So the second part of the piece of work ensued. I made about 4 or 5 of these roundels, and I just thought I'd just make them many and see which one works out the best. Belvedere Torso obviously is a replica that's always been in the Royal Academy, replica from the original in Rome. So this is the kind of way I was drawing here. I was thinking about the female gaze in this case, the female drawing intently onto the male body. Now we know it's called the Belvedere Torso, and I renamed this painting Belvedere, which is the Italian for a beautiful view, which I hoped it was a playful way of talking about the artist's, the female artist's gaze on the male model. And here is the finished painting here, Belvedere. Finally, the painting was removed from the studio, yay, and I have left with a blank wall, and was put together in the RA storage. And I love this photo of, it's a bit like the Wailing Wall of Angelica Kauffman, transported into the RA in very late days of August 2018, and installed in the ramp space leading to the restaurant. I'm not actually doing much here, I'm just dusting. Didn't have to repaint it. This is the installation of Belvedere in the RA Burlington House reception hall. I have to say, this was a bit tense. The other one was tense for the installation team. This one was tense for me because we'd never really measured it properly because the RA was under wraps. I'd never got a proper measurement of this roundel, and all the roundels are slightly different shapes because they're Victorian and they obviously were handmade at the time. So we did our best, and I hope for the best, and fortunately it worked out okay. I hadn't wanted to put up the gold frames because I liked it better without, and I thought the last thing she needed was to be clamped in by a heavy gold frame. So that work was more or less finished, entirely finished and installed, and the RA invited me to make a screen print with the help of Adam Hogarth, who's the print technician in the schools. And I made this silkscreen on the right, which is a composite of invention and rainbow. And finally, this is the rainbow in situ, and rather garish colours on this one, and yeah, seen through the window of the ticket hall. So there we go, that's a romp through my practice. I'll stop sharing the screen and hand back to Helen. Thank you all for listening.